Hi, everybody. This is Jeremy with the Next Big Idea Club, and I am joined this afternoon by Efosa Ojomo and Karen Dillon, the co-authors of the Next Big Idea Club spring finalist, The Prosperity Paradox, How Innovation Can Lift Nations Out of Poverty. A little bit of background. Efosa is a senior fellow at the Christensen Institute for Disruptive Innovation, where he leads the organization's global prosperity practice. His work has been published in the Harvard Business Review, The Guardian, Quartz, and more. And Karen is a former editor of the Harvard Business Review and the best-selling co-author of How Will You Measure Your Life and Competing Against Luck. She was named by Ashoka as one of the world's most influential and inspiring women. So to both of you, welcome and thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
Of course, of course. So let's get started with one of the central ideas that your book focuses on, where you point out that most of the poorest countries in 1960 are still, even today, the poorest countries in the world, despite the fact that that the U.S. and other countries have pumped literally trillions of dollars into assisting them. So why is it that a lot of this aid money doesn't seem to have really worked?
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. So that's one of the sort of central premises of our book. If you look at the 1960s, most poor countries then are still poor today, and there were some that are actually poor by measure of GDP per capita. By other metrics, they might be doing a bit better, but in terms of just being wealthier, some are actually poorer today, which was mind-blowing. And I think one of the main reasons that most development programs fail to create robust prosperity and economic development is because they're really not designed to. Most programs are really designed to fix poverty or to alleviate poverty. And that's one of the things we learned in doing research for this book is that the way you actually get to prosperity and the way you get to fixing poverty is not by fixing poverty. Right. And so I think that's sort of what we call the prosperity paradox. It's not the more you try to fix poverty in some circumstances, the more you worsen it. And it's by focusing on creating prosperity that you can actually get to fix poverty and create robust economic development.
Very interesting. Yeah. Karen, did you have anything to add there?
Yeah, I think you can liken it to treating the symptoms of a disease rather than getting to the root cause of the disease. And so over time, I think it's with really good intentions and really smart, thoughtful, well-meaning people working for these organizations and contributing aid money, they are temporarily solving and easing some of the pain points, which we see in the poverty that we see, but that's different than really changing the fundamental dynamics so that regions of the world are able to generate their own prosperity, and prosperity is the desired outcome, not poverty. They're different things. Having a really robust economy where people can rise, can have a better quality of life is something that comes from generating prosperity, not simply alleviating the symptoms of poverty.
Yeah, in fact, Jeremy, if I could jump in really quickly, one of the examples we talk about in the book was by my own failure, really, where in 2008, I began reading books about poverty and development and Africa and Asia. I was just really enthralled by these books. And then I got some friends together and I was like, let's start a nonprofit and let's go help some communities, build some wells. And I go into a few communities in Nigeria, we raise tens of thousands of dollars, and we build wells. And to Karen's point, right, that was fixing the symptoms, right? Because when I went into the communities, my focus was to alleviate poverty. It was to provide water, because poverty always shows itself as a lack of resources, a lack of food, lack of water, lack of clothing, and so on. And so there's this sort of instinctive, I think, reaction to provide the resources or to treat the symptoms, to use Karen's language. And that's what I did. But then a few months go by, I get a call when I'm back in the US that the wells are broken, right? And I'm like, well, crap, well, what do we do? What do we do? After that happened a few times, I was like, okay, this method, which really was a microcosm of the bigger development industry, where, as you rightly pointed out, we've invested trillions of dollars trying to fix this problem, is a microcosm of the bigger development industry. And you can sort of begin to see why many of these programs might temporarily help, but they don't create this robust development and prosperity we're all looking for.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I mean, as you say, poverty does so frequently manifest itself as a lack of food, a lack of water. And there's such an urgency to those things that I think from the outside looking in, I can totally understand that impulse to be like, oh my gosh, we got to give these people food. We got to give these people water. And then the rest will just kind of take care of itself. So I think it's a very understandable impulse. So my question to you guys is then, you write in the book a lot about the value of market creating innovations and how that is kind of a solution to the prosperity paradox, much more effective than simply providing water or providing food. So can you give me an example of what a market creating innovation looks like and how it works?
Absolutely. A market creating innovation, first and foremost, is simply an innovation that transforms a complicated and expensive product into something that's simple and affordable so many more people in society can have access to it, right? And the people who now have access to it who didn't, we call them non-consumers. So this market creating innovation targets directly non-consumers. Now, a perfect example of this, again, it's another one we wrote in the book, is 20 years ago, you've got an entrepreneur by the name of Mo Ibrahim. Mo Ibrahim is an executive in the UK. He's in London, but originally from Sudan. And he's in the telecommunications industry. And he looks at the landscape in Africa and says, you've got a continent, 800 and something million people, fewer than, I think, 10 million have phones. Let's go and build phones in this continent, the cell towers and so on. And his colleagues just laughed at him. They were like, oh, Mo, we thought you were smart. There's no way this could ever work. This thing is expensive. These people are corrupt. They're poor, AIDS. And I mean, they just gave all the reasons that it would never work. But he kept looking and seeing people struggle to communicate with friends, family, and colleagues, seeing that if I wanted to go visit my mom, I would have to trek sometimes for days to the village, if that's where she lived, to go see her. And he's like, there's no way creating a market that makes the cell phone affordable is not going to provide value. And so he, over time, left his job in the UK and decided to start building the cell phone infrastructure in several African countries. I'll cut the long story short, but he created a new market that targeted these non-consumers. And just a few stats, just to illustrate the impact. In 7 years, his company was grossing over $500 million with a B dollars a year, and he was able to sell it for $3.4 billion. And so now Mr. Ibrahim is a bona fide billionaire, and when we talked to him in preparing for this book, he was chilling out on his yacht in Monaco. Or maybe he wasn't chilling, but he was at least taking a call from his yacht in Monaco. And so it gives you an idea of the potential. Now that's awesome. It's awesome for Mo. But I think what really excites us when we think about market creating innovations is all the things they trigger in the economy. And so today, this is now 20 years from when he decided to build this. Today, the mobile telecommunications industry in Africa now supports close to 4 million jobs. It's estimated to provide anywhere from 150 to $200 billion in economic value.
Wow.
And it provides billions of dollars in taxes to many poor African governments a year. Right? These are taxes that these governments can then reinvest to build the nation's infrastructure, to build the nation's systems of governments and institutions, schools, hospitals, and so on. And so market creating innovations aren't the only thing you need, but when you invest in them and get them right, oh my gosh, they can create such a beautiful domino effect that can have this widespread impact. And so we truly believe in the power of market creating innovations to transform billions of lives.
Yeah, I think that's an incredible, really powerful example. And I'm wondering if you have anything to add to it, Karen. What do you think about market creating innovations and how powerful they can be?
Well, I'll give you a great example of why we should all believe how powerful they are. Those of us who live in the United States think of this, it is one of the most prosperous countries in the world. But really, 150 or so years ago, the United States was as impoverished as some of the countries we point to now on all those global charts. You know, we had, you know, children in labor, and we had people living just subsisting and spending most of their income on food just to survive. America was a really, you know, divided country, and most people were really poor. The engine that started to change all that were the market creating innovations we now forget about that have how big an impact they had. Henry Ford and his automobile, Isaac Merritt Singer and the Singer sewing machine, things like this that not only made a product affordable and accessible, but then had that knock-on domino effect that Efosa spoke of creating jobs and then actually creating other industries and helping to build infrastructure. America is a great example of what's possible. It's the older version of an example, and we see it happening around the world now currently, but that's the fast forward. That's how quickly and dramatically it can change an economy's trajectory.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think it's really cool to have that example that hits a little bit closer to home as well. And so, you know, taking both of these examples, it seems that a core part of your argument in the book, and you know, please feel free to correct me if I'm not quite getting this right. It seems that prosperity really depends on consumption, and that maybe the two are so closely linked that they almost become synonymous. And my question is there any other path to prosperity? Like, I know that some thinkers out there, like Rutger Bregman, for example, is a really big proponent of universal basic income. So I just wanted to get your guys' thoughts on some of these other potential paths. Like, do you think that consumption is really the best or only way to do it, or are there others as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. That's a great question, Jeremy. And with the, you know, there's a conversation about universal basic income in the development industry. There's also a conversation about what I'd call sort of cash transfers, right? Sometimes they're conditional cash transfers. Other times they're what do you call them? They're sort of unconditional. Just give poor people money. But, you know, a couple of questions we have to ask. Number one, where is the, you know, this universal basic income? We have to go back to first principles. Where's the money going to come from, right? That's number one. Like, is it going to come out of thin air? And so we have to really try to figure that part out. Who's going to create that value? And number two, what are people going to use the money for? Ultimately, they're going to use it to consume. They're going to use it to consume health, education, housing, food, and things like that, right? And so I think those might be interesting distribution mechanisms, right? How we distribute value, but you have to create that value somehow. It cannot come out of thin air. And I think that's sometimes where those arguments or those ideas might conflate the notion of creating value and distributing value. In today's world, we talk a lot about income inequality as an example, which is connected to some of these conversations, universal basic income and so on. And capitalism gets a really bad rap. And I try to remind people that, look, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater, okay? Let us try to understand the idea of creating value first and distributing value. And so the fact that a lot of the value that's been created over the past 40, 50 years has gone to the top 1 or 0.1% is a different argument than the fact that the fundamental way you create value in society is by solving people's problems in a way that's productive and profitable. Right. Let's divide the two and then try to solve for each.
I love that. That's beautifully said. Karen, any thoughts?
I just would say, I mean, maybe there are other ways to solve the problem. I think we think in the book that we don't have every answer to every question. We're just trying to start a great conversation. But what we do know is that this has worked, you know, over centuries. Like, we can see the pattern historically, and it's working now. So this is a proven path to prosperity, and thus I think worth being taken very seriously.
Absolutely. I also wanted to touch on one other theme of your book, which has already come up a couple times in this conversation, which is that in crisis, there seems to be opportunity. And there's one really interesting example that you write about in Mexico, about what I believe what the founder refers to as the McDonald's of diabetes care. And that was such a striking story that I hoped that one of you could tell our viewers about it. Would you mind going into that?
Sure. Or I will tell. This is a great story of a guy called Javier Lozano, who is Mexican and had come to the United States for his graduate degree. I think he was at MIT, but he cross-registered in a course that Clay Christensen was teaching actually at Harvard Business School. So he was exposed to these ideas. And one of his projects was to work on some kind of technology related to diabetes in the United States. But he was just really enamored with the technology that was possible to capture data and what was possible in being on top of diabetic care. And it turned out that his own mother in Mexico was a type 2 diabetic. And so he just called her enthusiastically saying, like, did you know there's all this cool stuff that you can do for your diabetes? And a little bit chiding, sort of his family had always, looked a little bit down on her taking care of her own diabetes, that she wasn't well in control of it. And they thought she just ate too much sugar. They kind of blamed her a little bit. And she had a lot of trouble controlling her diabetes and was feeling despondent about it, really. And so as she listened to him bubbling on about his own cool technology, it sort of occurred to him and it occurred to her that this is not something that was even imaginable in her life. And she didn't want to be suffering with her diabetes. And she really was feeling really despondent about what her path is. Diabetes is one of the leading causes of death in Mexico right now, and amputations in certain parts of it. It's an epidemic as it is other place. And it clicked for him that it had been so difficult to get good care for type 2 diabetics in Mexico that there just had to be a better way. So what he did with his training and education in that moment of inspiration, which hit home, his own mother, was to set up a series of clinics where, for an annual membership fee that was affordable for most people, instead of having to go to all different doctors, making different appointments, never feeling in control, never fully understanding what's happening to you because you're just one patient of many with doctors who deal with many other issues, to set up a really specialized clinic where you can go in with your annual membership and get seen in the 7 or 8 different stations that one needs to take care of your diabetes. It basically made a specialist care. And it became so logical and practical and smart for so many people. The day he opened his doors for the first time, his mother was mad because she wasn't patient number one. There were people already ahead of her in line. And Efosa can tell you some of the details of how successful it's been now in setting up this thing where, back to the market creating innovation, it made it affordable and accessible for real people to get much better control of their care. Efosa, just talk about how successful it has been.
Now, I mean, look, I think in the same way many of Mo Ibrahim's colleagues laughed at him and said, this is never going to work, Javier Lozano had a bunch of people laugh at him and say, there's no way this is ever going to work. Before he created Clínicas del Azúcar, to get diabetes care, you spent on average about $1,000 a year. And you went to visit so many different hospitals. His solution is a very streamlined chain of clinics where you spend roughly $250 a year. So think about 25% the cost in terms of financial, not even traveling around. And you go to one clinic, it's standardized. And so to your point about McDonald's of diabetes, you literally walk into any of his clinics and it looks the same. And you get care from trained professionals. It leverages similar technologies. And today, not only is he the largest provider of diabetes care in the country from in the private sector, but he has now inspired a bunch of copycats. And so remember those people who said, oh, this is never going to work. How are you going to, they are now copying him. And that is the beautiful thing, one of the beautiful things I think about market creating innovations, right? The people who are naysayers, right? Those who can't quite see what you can see are some of the people who might even go in after you prove the market is possible to create. And so if you play this out, right? Play this out over the next 10, 20 years like we did with Mo Ibrahim, you can imagine the kind of impact this could have in the Mexican healthcare landscape, right? If every single person who's struggling with diabetes now has a clinic that's very close and it's affordable. Think about the jobs it'll create. Think about the impact in public health. Think about how they might apply the principles in solving this problem to other healthcare ailments, right? And so on the one hand, you can look at Javier Lozano as just, oh, he helped us with diabetes a little bit. But then on the other hand, you look at it through the lens of market creating innovation and sort of Mexico as a whole and you know, just Latin America in general, and you're like, wow, this is transformative, right? And I think that is what we're really trying to show in the book, how transformative this kind of thinking is. Even though it might start out small, but wow, when you play it out, it can change nations.
I just want to add one really fun detail, happy ending detail of this story is his mother was initially so despondent talking about her own diabetic care and really ready to kind of give up on herself of it ever getting better. And fast forward to today, in the clinic, they realized early on that patients sometimes when they'd get a call from a nurse or a doctor to check in, how are you doing? Would fib or lie, you know, I'm taking my medicine, my blood sugar numbers are really good, because they were too polite not to. His mother realized, you know, people need to talk to people who really understand. So you can't have a person in a white coat calling to ask if you're complying with your you know, strict controls. So his mother is now in charge of that patient one-to-one counseling and checking, and she works in the office with him. So she's gone from being despondent about her own future to being so enthusiastic and actually helping create the market creating innovation that probably played a role in saving her own life and certainly will play a role in saving lots of lives in Mexico as well.
That's so cool. What a great story that is. And I think one of my favorite parts about it is that it illustrates that capitalism doesn't have to be a zero-sum game, right? Like, you know, as you mentioned, Efosa, capitalism so often gets a bad rap. Like there's this perception out there that capitalism has to mean that the 1% is exploiting the 99%. Like that's just inherent in the system, but it doesn't have to be, right? Like this is an example that illustrates that. Look, that you know, that the founder, you know, saw a need and he started a program that, yes, you know, did make him some money and people were paying for it, but at the end of the day, you know, their lives were significantly improved as a result, and the society as a whole was enriched, and health seemed to get a lot better. So I don't know. I think that makes a lot of sense, especially with that example.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things we write in the book is, you know, nobody gets fired for building a well, right? I mean, if you go and tell your buddies over coffee or dinner this evening, hey guys, you know, lots of people in Africa don't have water. Let's raise money. Let's build a well. They're not going to be like, Jeremy, you're such a bad person. Why? How would you do that? How can you be so mean? I mean, you know, and so we continue to do that. That's what I did. I mean, people thought I was a saint. I mean, when we started the organization, even though you look at the impact, it's like, oh my gosh, the wells just kept breaking down. But if you tell your friends, hey guys, you know, I think I've come up with this new product that we can go into these countries and we can sell them to people who make less than $3 a day. It's like, oh, Jeremy, how could you? Like, you know, that's not nice. And it's like, no. Like Karen said, that's where we were 200 years ago, 150 years ago. We created the market. In doing that, people improve their lives. They get jobs. They get dignity. They take care of themselves, their families, their kids. I mean, like, it's such a beautiful story, I think, of how societies can evolve with dignity. I think we are so committed to this message and trying to spread it as far and as wide as we can.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes total sense. And I know that, you know, one of my personal favorite thinkers, Jaron Lanier, writes a lot about this whole notion of economic dignity as well. Mm-hmm. And it strikes me that that's a real advantage of this approach where, you know, you're putting the locus of control in the hands of the everyday person, you know. Mm-hmm. You know, and I think that's a really powerful thing. So, you know, one thing I wanted to maybe close with is this question of what can we do? You know, even just the average person. You know, not all of us has you know, all this money to invest in a brand new company or startup, and not everyone really has the the ability to start one themselves. So does this mean that we should, like, do we stop giving to charity? Because clearly that's maybe not the best use of our money. I don't know. Like, what exactly can the average person do with this in mind to help lift nations out of poverty and into prosperity?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a brilliant question. It's one that we are still grappling with, especially the way you asked it. Like, what can the average person do? If you're asking me what can Bill Gates do, that's very different. I would simply tell him to go build a bunch of Microsofts in many of these countries, and over time, then these countries are not going to need the Gates Foundation anymore. But I think when you ask me what can the average person do, I think knowledge is important. So just the awareness of understanding how these mechanisms work. So that's one. And so spreading the message and these ideas to push their thinking. The second is, chapter 2 in the book is titled Not All Innovations Created Equal. And I think not all charities or NGOs are created equal as well. And so I think there is an opportunity for us who maybe it's $20 a month we can afford, or $20 a year. We can investigate what is this organization doing that is going to help these regions. That's essentially going to empower these regions, right? Sort of teach a man to fish versus give a man a fish. And I think if we investigate those, there are NGOs doing brilliant work. We write about some of them at the back of the book. And I think the last thing that people can do is, if you're able, I'd say visit these countries, invest in these countries. I think that one of the things that can change stereotypes as quickly as anything is engagement. And so we might think, oh, they're helpless, they can't do anything to this. But when you visit and you see, you're like, man, these are some of the most industrious people in the world to live in these kinds of circumstances, right? But we understand not everybody is equally endowed. And so I think those are some options.
I love it. I think that makes a lot of sense. As you say, knowledge is power, and being thoughtful about which charities are trying to put a Band-Aid over the problem versus or treating the symptoms, as you mentioned, Karen, versus really treating the underlying problem. With these principles in mind, I think we'll have much better guidelines in making those judgment calls. Karen, did you have any closing reflections or anything to add there?
I would just add that what we were talking about in the book, we talk about a lot of international examples, but the same principles apply here in the US as well. We have lots of parts of the country that are struggling from having been in a previous age of glory, and market creating innovations are not based on geography. They're based on helping people get out of the things they're struggling with in their lives. So the same thinking holds true for those of us here in America too, to be looking for opportunities. You don't have to be traveling to Nigeria to see the possibility. It could be in some of the impoverished parts of our own country. And I think that's very powerful to think about as well.
Absolutely. Well, I think that sounds like a perfect note to end on. So Efosa Ojomo and Karen Dillon, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having us.
It's a pleasure.